The train was 40 minutes late, which meant Evelyn Hart had 40 extra minutes to sit with her hands folded in her lap and convince herself that everything was going to be fine. She was not especially good at convincing herself of things. The car smelled of coal smoke and the particular sourness of too many bodies traveling too long a distance without adequate ventilation. A woman 2 rows ahead had a baby that had been crying since Kansas. Across the aisle, a traveling salesman with pomade in his hair kept stealing glances at Evelyn's trunk, as though calculating its value. Outside the grimy window, Colorado was happening, dry red earth and scrub pine, and a sky so wide and indifferent it made her chest feel tight in a way she couldn't quite name. Evelyn was 28 years old, which in the summer of 1887 put her squarely in the territory of women who had, as her mother once phrased it with characteristic delicacy, allowed their prospects to become complicated. She was not beautiful in the fashion that turned heads on Boston sidewalks. She was solid-framed and square-jawed, with dark hair she could never quite tame, and eyes that people occasionally described as striking, usually in the tone of someone trying to be kind. She had worked as a bookkeeper for 6 years at a dry goods firm on Tremont Street, which had given her very good arithmetic and absolutely nothing else that was considered useful for a woman in her situation. Her situation being alone, unmarried, and in possession of a one-way ticket to a town called Harlan's Creek, Colorado, where a rancher named Douglas Pratt was waiting to make her his wife. She pulled his last letter from her coat pocket. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds. Miss Hart, I'm a plain-spoken man, and I will not waste either of our time with excessive sentiment. I require a woman of steady character and practical disposition to manage my household and share in the work of this ranch. I am told you are both. I have enclosed a photograph. If you find my appearance agreeable, I ask that you write back promptly with your decision. The offer will not remain open indefinitely. It was not, Evelyn had to admit, a love letter, but she had written back promptly, because Douglas Pratt had also enclosed a photograph of a ranch spread across a valley with mountains behind it that made her breath catch, and because the dry goods firm on Tremont Street had just let her go, and because her mother had died in March, and left behind nothing but debts, and a boarding house room that Evelyn could no longer afford. She had written back. And Douglas Pratt had written again, more warmly this time, asking questions about her experience and her family, and once, almost shyly, whether she liked horses. And Evelyn had answered every question honestly, and 4 months later she had packed everything she owned into one trunk and one carpet bag and gotten on a train. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she was not a romantic. She had read his letters so many times the paper had gone soft. Harlan's Creek announced itself as a water tower and a scattering of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from a height and left where they fell. The train slowed with a long groan of metal, and Evelyn pressed her face to the window and tried to make it look like a place where a person could build a life. It was not an easy thing to do. The platform was busy for a town so small. A freight delivery had just arrived, and men were hauling crates from the rear cars, while a depot agent in a stained vest shouted conflicting instructions. 2 older women sat on a bench outside the station house, watching the commotion with the particular fixed attention of people who considered watching commotion to be a legitimate form of entertainment. Evelyn stepped off the train with her carpet bag in one hand and her chin up. This was something she had decided on the long ride through Kansas, that whatever happened, she would step off the train with her chin up. She spotted Douglas Pratt almost immediately. He had sent her his photograph too, and he looked like it. A tall man in his 40s with a rangy build and a sun-darkened face and a mustache she had privately thought was a bit much. He was standing near the far end of the platform, hat in his hand, turning it around and around by the brim in a way that suggested nerves. There was a woman standing beside him. Evelyn noticed her in the way you notice weather that's about to change. Not a conscious thought so much as a shift in the body, a tightening. The woman was young, perhaps 20, with pale blonde hair piled under a straw hat and a waist that looked like a man could put both hands around it. She was laughing at something Pratt had said, one gloved hand resting lightly on his arm. Evelyn slowed without meaning to. Pratt saw her. His expression did something complicated, a flash of something that might have been guilt, gone almost before it registered. And then he straightened his shoulders and walked toward her with the deliberate gait of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "Miss Hart," he said. Mr. Pratt. She kept her voice even. It's good to meet you in person. He did not say the same. He stopped about 3 feet away from her, which was not the distance of a man greeting his intended. He held his hat in both hands now, turning it faster. I need to speak with you plainly, he said. I believe you'd prefer that to any other approach. The platform had gotten quieter around them, Evelyn realized. The freight workers had slowed their work. The 2 women on the bench had leaned forward. The traveling salesman from the train had materialized nearby with his sample case, not going anywhere. All right, she said. I wrote to you about the position here in good faith, Pratt said. And I don't doubt you're a woman of the character you described. But circumstances have changed since my last letter. He glanced back toward the blonde woman, who was watching them now with an expression caught somewhere between pity and satisfaction. Miss Clara Yates and I have come to an understanding. It happened recently, and I should have written, but I wasn't sure how to... You're telling me you're engaged, Evelyn said. Yes, that's right. To someone else. Yes. She stood with that for a moment. The sun was very bright. Somewhere behind her, the baby from the train was still crying. I see, she said. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Pratt said, and he had the decency to look pained when he said it. But he did say inconvenience, which was a word that described a missed appointment or a misplaced order form, and not a woman who had sold nearly everything she owned and traveled 2,000 miles to marry someone. Is there a hotel in town? She said. It wasn't quite a question. The Calloway house, just off the main street. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded bill, held it out to her. I'd like to cover your accommodation for a few nights while you make arrangements. Evelyn looked at the bill for a long moment. She looked at his hand. She looked at Clara Yates, who had moved closer and was watching with very wide, very interested eyes. The entire platform was watching. She took the money. She was not proud of it, and she did not pretend to herself that she was. But she had $4.30 in her carpet bag, and a one-way ticket that had already been used, and pride was a luxury she could not currently afford. Thank you, she said. Then she picked up her carpet bag, left her trunk where it sat on the platform, and walked away from Douglas Pratt without looking back. She heard the murmurs start up behind her before she'd gone 20 feet. The Calloway house was a 2-story building with a sagging porch and curtains in the windows that had once been white. The woman who ran it, Mrs. Calloway herself, was somewhere in her 60s, with the efficient movements of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything life produced. She gave Evelyn a room on the 2nd floor, accepted payment without comment, and asked if she wanted supper sent up. No, Evelyn said. Thank you. The room was small and clean, with a single window overlooking the alley behind the building. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry. She was not, in general, a woman who cried easily, and she considered this either a strength or a damage, depending on the day. Today, it felt like neither. Today, it just felt like the way things were. She took stock of her situation the way she would have taken stock of an account ledger. Assets, approximately $6. 1 trunk of clothing and household goods on a train platform. Practical arithmetic. 6 years of bookkeeping experience that no one in Harlan's Creek, Colorado was likely to need. Liabilities, no return ticket, no family to wire, no acquaintances within 500 miles. A reputation in this town that had, in the space of about 4 minutes, been reduced to the woman Pratt sent for and then didn't want. She sat with the numbers for a long time. She did not sleep well. She woke early with the particular grim clarity that comes after a night of poor sleep, dressed herself carefully, because she had learned long ago that the way you dressed yourself when things were bad was a kind of small declaration, and went down to the dining room for breakfast. The dining room had 6 tables. 3 of them were occupied. Every single person in the room looked up when she walked in, and she watched them try to decide whether to acknowledge her or stare at the table, and she thought, this is what it will be like. She sat down. She ordered coffee and eggs. She ate with her back straight. A woman at the nearest table leaned toward her companion and said something in a low voice, and her companion made a soft sound that could have been sympathy or could have been something else. Evelyn did not look up from her plate. After breakfast, she retrieved her trunk from the station. The depot agent helped her haul it inside without meeting her eyes. She asked him about opportunities for employment in the town, bookkeeping, clerking, teaching, and he said there was a school teacher already, and the mercantile handled its own accounts, and there wasn't much else of that sort of work around here. She thanked him and went back to the Calloway house and sat in her room and thought about what came next. What came next, as best she could calculate, was that she had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks at the boarding house. After that, she would need income or she would need to leave, and leaving required money she didn't have. She could wire a former colleague in Boston for a loan, but she had left Boston under circumstances that had strained most of her professional relationships, and asking for charity from people she'd worked beside felt like a particular kind of defeat she wasn't ready to accept. She had the sense of walls moving in from several directions at once. She heard about Cole Mercer that afternoon. She was in the mercantile, pricing the cost of basic provisions against her dwindling funds, when 2 men came in talking loudly about an altercation at the stockyards. Evelyn paid them no attention until one of them said the name Mercer, in a tone that suggested it meant something. "He's down a man since Briggs left," the other one said, "going into summer roundup with a short crew. Mercer'll manage. Man runs that place like a—" They lowered their voices and moved away down the aisle. Evelyn went back to her calculations, but she filed the name away. She filed it away more deliberately the next morning when she overheard Mrs. Calloway talking to a delivery man in the kitchen. "Won't find anyone willing to go out there for the cooking work," the delivery man was saying. "Not after what happened to the last woman." "Martha Donahue left of her own accord," Mrs. Calloway said firmly. "That man didn't run her off. She left quick enough. She left because the work was hard and she didn't expect it to be hard. That's a different thing from being run off." A sound of dishes being stacked. "Mercer Ranch pays decent wages, better than decent. Man's unsociable as a barn cat and twice as stubborn." "A person can be unsociable and still be fair," Mrs. Calloway said. "I found the 2 things aren't necessarily related." Evelyn stood in the hallway and thought about this. She went back to her room and looked at her ledger and thought about it some more. Then she went back downstairs and knocked on the kitchen door. Mrs. Calloway looked up from the pot she was stirring. "The Mercer Ranch," Evelyn said. "How far is it from town?" "Yeah." The ride out was 7 miles on a borrowed horse that Mrs. Calloway had arranged with characteristic efficiency and no unnecessary conversation. The road was unpaved, and the landscape was the kind that didn't care whether you found it beautiful or not. Dry grass running up to scrub pine, the mountains sitting large and blue on the western horizon, a sky that looked like it had never had a ceiling. Evelyn was not a skilled rider. She had ridden in parks occasionally, in a supervised and largely decorative way. This was different. The horse had opinions about pace. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, her back ached and her hands were raw, and she was fairly certain she had done something ill-advised to her left knee on a patch of uneven ground. She stopped at the gate and looked at the place. It was not what she'd imagined. The main house was solidly built, 2 stories with a long covered porch across the front. But it had the look of a place maintained rather than tended. Everything functional, nothing ornamental. The flower beds that might once have been flower beds now given over entirely to weeds. The barn and outbuildings were in better shape than the house, which told her something about the man who owned it. A large dog of ambiguous breed materialized from somewhere and stood watching her with an air of professional skepticism. A man was splitting wood at the side of the yard. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical solidity that came from years of actual work rather than any particular intention. His hat was pushed back and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, and he had not looked up, although he had certainly heard her approach. She waited a moment. He did not look up. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He split a log cleanly, set the pieces aside, and reached for another. "Ranch isn't hiring. I heard you were short a hand going into Roundup." "I'm short a cowhand. That's a different situation." "I heard your cook position is vacant." He paused, axe raised. Then he brought it down. "Where'd you hear that?" "Mrs. Calloway." Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite amusement, not quite annoyance, a little of both. He set the axe down and turned to look at her properly for the first time. His eyes were an unremarkable gray-green, and they were doing what she recognized as an assessment. Not the kind that evaluated her figure, the kind that evaluated everything else. "You're the woman from the train," he said. It was not a question. Evelyn had expected this. had spent the 7 miles here deciding how she would respond to it, and still the words landed with a small, dull impact. "I am," she said. "My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm a capable woman with good arithmetic and limited frontier experience who needs employment. Your cook position is vacant. I'd like to discuss terms." Cole Mercer looked at her for a long moment. The dog sat down next to his boot and yawned. "Can you cook?" he said. "I can learn," she said. "I learn quickly." "That's not the same as yes." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He picked up his axe again. She thought he was going to turn back to the wood, and that would be the end of it, and she was already calculating how much longer her money would last and what she would do after that. "House is a mess," he said instead, still looking at the wood. "Cowboys are worse. Pay is $12 a month plus room and board. Work starts before sunup and doesn't stop when you want it to." He glanced at her. "Still want to discuss terms?" "Yes," she said. "Then get off that horse and come in. You look like you're about to fall off it anyway." He was not wrong. She was about to fall off the horse. She did not fall off it. She dismounted with what she felt was adequate dignity, tied the horse to the porch rail, and followed Cole Mercer inside. The kitchen was the first thing she saw because it was the first room off the back entrance, and it stopped her in the doorway. Mess had been a conservative description. The stove had a buildup of grease on the left burner that suggested it had gone unaddressed for months. There were pots stacked haphazardly on shelves and on the floor. A sack of flour had been left open on the table, and something, probably mice, had been at the corner of it. The window above the basin looked out on the yard and had a broken latch that let in flies. "How many men are you feeding?" she said. "6 cowboys. Me. Possibly a 7th man during roundup." She did her arithmetic. 3 meals a day. Breakfast before sunup, dinner at noon out in the field during roundup, supper at 6. She looked at the stove, at the flour sack, at the general chaos of the kitchen, and thought about the $6 in her carpet bag and the walls moving in from all directions. "All right," she said. "I'll need to clean this kitchen before I can cook in it. And the flour sack needs to be replaced. There's mouse damage. And the left burner on that stove needs to be degreased or it's a fire hazard." Mercer leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Most people look at this kitchen and want to leave," he said. "I've wanted to leave approximately 4 times since I got here," Evelyn said. "I haven't, though." He looked at her a moment more. Then he nodded, once, and pushed off from the doorframe. "There's a room off the back of the house," he said. "Small. You can have it. I'll have one of the men bring your things from town if you want to send word to Calloway." He started toward the front of the house, then paused. "Supper is usually at 6. Cowboys are going to look at you the same way the whole town looked at you this morning." Evelyn said nothing. "I'm not trying to be cruel," he said, without turning around. "I'm telling you because you should know what you're walking into." "I know what I'm walking into, Mr. Mercer." He glanced back then, a quick look, almost sharp, like he was revising an estimate. "All right," he said, and then he walked away. Evelyn did not cook supper that first night. She spent 4 hours cleaning the kitchen, degreasing the stove, scrubbing the shelves, dealing with the flour situation, tracking down where the mice were getting in and blocking the gap as best she could with wadded burlap. She swept the floor twice. She found a tin of lard that had gone rancid and disposed of it. She reorganized the shelves so that things were where she could find them. It was past 9 o'clock by the time she stopped. Her hands were red and her back ached worse than it had from the ride, and she was hungry because she'd been working through what should have been the supper hour. She found bread in the larder and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark yard. The night sounds were different here than anywhere she'd ever slept. Insects and wind and something farther off, a coyote or something larger, a long carrying call that sounded almost lonely. She was in Colorado. She was sleeping in a room off the back of a stranger's ranch house. She had approximately $5 left and a job that started before sunup. She tried to think of how she'd arrived at this point and found she couldn't quite work the narrative into a shape that felt like it led here with any logic. She had been a bookkeeper in Boston. She had kept meticulous ledgers. She had been, by all reasonable measures, a person with a sensible and functional life. And now she was here. She finished the bread. She washed her hands. She checked the stove one more time and went to bed. But she was up at 4:30. She had always woken easily, which she'd never considered a particular virtue until that morning when the darkness outside was absolute and her body pulled itself out of sleep without complaint. While every other instinct screamed that this was not a reasonable hour, she built up the stove fire, which took her 3 attempts because she was not practiced at it. She found eggs in the cold box and a side of bacon hanging in the larder and a quantity of potatoes that needed peeling. She could cook eggs. She was not a remarkable cook, but she had lived alone long enough to be functional. The first cowboy came in at 5:15, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and stared at her. He was young, maybe 20, with a freckled face and the general look of someone who'd had a recent growth spurt that the rest of him hadn't entirely adjusted to. "You the new cook?" he said. "Yes." He looked around the kitchen. Something moved across his face. Surprise, possibly. "This place looks different. I cleaned it." "Huh." He sat down at the table. "Tom Briggs, he was the last one. He never cleaned it." I noticed. His name was Henry, she learned over the course of the next hour as the rest of the crew filtered in. He was 19 and had been on the Mercer Ranch for 2 years, and was originally from Ohio, and still had occasionally homesick feelings about it that he had apparently decided she was safe to admit. The other cowboys were less forthcoming. They sat down, they ate, they assessed her with varying degrees of subtlety, and they did not say much. An older man named Walt, weathered and spare, with a white mustache and the air of someone who had strong opinions about nearly everything and had learned to keep most of them to himself, ate 2 plates of eggs and said, eventually, "Better than Tom's." "That's not a high bar," Henry said. Walt looked at him. Henry went back to his eggs. Cole Mercer came in last, when the others were nearly done. He sat at the end of the table, poured his own coffee, and ate without speaking. He was not cold, exactly. There was nothing hostile in his manner, but he had the focused self-containment of a man who had long ago arranged his life to require the minimum amount of social maintenance. He looked up once and caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen. "Stove's working better," he said. "I degreased the burner." He nodded and went back to his coffee. That was the entirety of their exchange that first morning. The weeks that followed were the hardest she could remember, and she had a fairly extensive catalog of hard things to compare them against. Cooking for 8 men 3 times a day was a physical operation of a scale she had not imagined. The logistics alone, the quantities, the timing, the management of a wood stove that had moods she was only beginning to understand, required a kind of concentrated, ongoing attention that left little room for anything else. She burned things. She miscalculated quantities. She served cornbread one evening that was so dense, Henry picked his piece up and rapped it experimentally against the table edge, and the sound it made caused the man across from him to start laughing, and Evelyn stood at the stove and thought very deliberately about the fact that she had survived worse than bad cornbread. She learned by doing, which was the only method available. She asked Walt questions when she could, because Walt was the only one who seemed to understand that knowing things wasn't the same as weakness. She borrowed a cookbook from Mrs. Calloway on her first trip to town and read it cover to cover in 2 evenings. She paid attention to what got eaten and what got left, and she adjusted. The cowboys were not cruel. They were, for the most part, men who had learned to keep their own counsel and did not particularly see it as their business to make a newcomer's life harder than it already was. But they watched her. They were waiting, she understood, to see whether she would last, whether she was the kind of woman who, when things got difficult enough, would simply leave. It was not a malicious watching. It was the watchfulness of people who had seen enough turnover in that kitchen to have stopped expecting permanence. Cole Mercer did not watch her in the same way. He watched her the way he watched everything, with a flat, practical attention, taking inventory. When the sourdough she'd been working on for a week finally came out right, he ate 2 pieces and said nothing. When she accidentally oversalted a pot of beans so thoroughly they were inedible, and she had to throw them out and start over with less than an hour to dinner, he found her in the kitchen red-faced and frustrated and said, without preamble, "What do you have that can replace it?" "Salt pork," she said, "and there's enough flour for biscuits if I work fast." "Then work fast," he said, and left. That was the closest thing to encouragement she received, and it was more than she'd expected. 6 weeks in, she was sitting on the back steps after supper, listening to the evening settle in tonight, and trying to determine whether the ache in her feet was temporary or a permanent feature of her new life, when Walt came out and sat on the lower step without asking. They were quiet for a while. Walt had a pipe he wasn't smoking, just turning over in his hands. "You staying?" he said. It wasn't hostile. "That's the plan," Evelyn said. Tom Briggs lasted 4 months. Woman before him, different woman, couple years back, lasted 3 weeks. "I heard about her. She wasn't a bad cook," Walt said. "Work just ground her down." Evelyn considered this. "Do you think it'll grind me down?" Walt looked at the pipe. "Don't know yet," he said, which was the most honest answer he could have given. "Ask me in another month." She was quiet for a moment. "Why do they leave?" she said. "Really? I've heard it's the work, but I don't think it's just the work." Walt turned the pipe over once more and then tucked it in his shirt pocket. He looked out at the dark mountains against the darker sky. "Cole's not easy to work for," he said finally. "He's fair. He's not easy." A pause. "He was married about 5 years ago. Wife left, took the baby, went back to her family in St. Louis. Cole's never said much about it. We don't ask." Another pause. "He shut something down after that. Works harder than any man on the ranch. Makes all the decisions himself. Doesn't ask for things, and doesn't particularly want things offered." Evelyn thought about the man who'd looked at her across the kitchen and said, "Then work fast," and then walked away. "He's not cruel," she said. "No, he's not." Walt pushed himself up from the step. He keeps his distance from people, and living out here, that can make a place feel pretty hollow." He went inside. Evelyn sat with her aching feet in the wide Colorado night and thought about hollowness and distance, and the difference between a place that was hard because of the work and a place that was hard because of something else entirely. Then she went inside and made a list of what she needed from town and went to bed. Dim. The morning the cattle thieves came, she was elbow-deep in bread dough and running her usual calculation of whether there was enough time before breakfast to let it rise properly. She would not know until much later that it had been planned, that someone in town had sold information about the schedule of the Mercer herd's movement toward summer pasture, that the men who came up the north draw before dawn had been watching the ranch for 2 days. In the moment, what she knew was a shout from the barn, then 2 more shouts, and then a sound like a crack of thunder, except the sky was clear. She was out the back door before she'd consciously decided to move. The yard was chaos in the gray pre-dawn light. The dog was barking in a register she'd never heard before. Cowboys were running. From the far side of the barn came the sound of horses and shouting and more of that thunder crack sound, and she understood, not abstractly but viscerally in her sternum, that it was gunfire. Henry came around the corner of the barn, running full out, and nearly collided with her. "Get back inside," he said, breathless. "What's happening?" "Rustlers. North pasture. Get inside and stay there." He was gone again before she could answer. She went back inside. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sounds of violence outside and thought about the fact that she had very little ability to affect what was happening and that the most useful thing she could do was be ready for whatever came after. She put water on to heat. She found the small tin box where the ranch kept its basic medical supplies. She had taken inventory of it in her first week because she took inventory of everything and set it on the table. Bandages, carbolic acid, a needle and thread she was fairly sure no one had ever used for the intended purpose, a small bottle of laudanum, half empty. She stood and waited. The sounds outside went on for a long time. Walt came through this back door first, breathing hard, with a gash along his forearm that was bleeding significantly, but not, she thought, dangerously. Behind him were 2 cowboys she knew only slightly, uninjured but shaken. "How bad?" she said. 2 men got hit, Walt said. "Grazes, both of them. Cole—" He stopped. She looked at him. "Cole took a bad one," Walt said. "Shoulder. He's down. We got him on a horse, but it's not good. Henry's bringing him in now." Evelyn looked at the pot of heating water, at the medical tin, at the needle and thread. "Is there a doctor?" she said. "Nearest doctor's in Garrett, 20 miles. 20 miles. She did her arithmetic. Even at full gallop, someone wouldn't be back with a doctor for 2 hours at the minimum, probably longer. "Bring him in," she said. "And somebody ride for Garrett now." She heard Walt say something behind her as she moved to make space on the kitchen table. But she was already past listening, already running her own calculations against a set of numbers that had nothing to do with cookbooks or flour sacks. The man who had looked at her across this kitchen and said, "Then work fast," was coming through the door bleeding. And there was no one else. And she had 2 hours and whatever was in a tin box and whatever she could remember from a first aid pamphlet she'd read 8 years ago in Boston and never expected to use. She moved the bread dough off the table. She was ready when they brought him in. They brought Cole Mercer in through the back door, the way you'd carry something fragile that had already broken. Carefully, too carefully, in the manner of men who didn't know what else to do with their hands. Henry had one arm under Cole's good shoulder. A cowboy named Dix had the other side. Cole was conscious, which was something, but his face had the grayish, waxy quality of a man whose body was spending everything it had on staying upright and had nothing left over for the ordinary work of looking alive. He saw the cleared kitchen table and made a sound low in his throat. "No," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. She had already moved to help guide him down. "Sit. Let me see it." "I don't need Mr. Mercer." Her voice was not sharp, but it was the voice she'd learned to use when a cowboy tried to argue with her about whether supper was ready, and she needed the argument to stop. "Sit down." He sat. Partly because Henry and Dix weren't giving him much choice, and partly, she thought, because the effort of arguing required resources he currently didn't have. The wound was in his left shoulder, high up, close to where the shoulder met the neck. His shirt was soaked through and the blood was still moving, which meant nothing critical had been hit or he'd already be unconscious. But the amount of it alarmed her in a way she kept carefully off her face. She had learned that faces were contagious, that fear wore itself visibly and transferred itself quickly. And so she kept hers neutral and focused and did not let it show what she was actually thinking, which was that the nearest doctor was 20 miles away and she was a bookkeeper from Boston. "Someone rode for Garrett?" she said without looking up. "Dix went," Henry said from behind her, "fast as the bay can run." "Good." "Henry, I need more light. There's a lamp in the front room. Bring it in. Walt." She looked up briefly. Walt was standing in the doorway with his arm wrapped in a rag, watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely interpret. "Sit down somewhere. You're next. Don't let that arm go cold." "It's fine," Walt said. "I didn't ask how it was. I said sit down." Walt sat. Cole made a sound that under other circumstances might have been a laugh. It came out as something else. She got his shirt off with Henry's help, Cole gritting his teeth and not making a sound, which cost him. She could see it costing him in the set of his jaw and the way his one good hand gripped the table edge. The wound was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The bullet had gone in below the collarbone and angled back out through the shoulder, a through and through, which was the best possible outcome for a gunshot wound in a kitchen 20 miles from medical help. But the exit wound was ragged and both openings were bleeding steadily. She needed to clean it. She needed to pack it. She needed to stop the bleeding and not introduce infection, and then wait 2 hours for a doctor who would either confirm she'd done the right things or explain why she hadn't. She opened the medical tin and started working. "This is going to hurt," she said. It was not a warning so much as a statement of fact, offered in the same tone she'd used to note that the weather was changing. "I'm aware," Cole said. She poured carbolic acid over the wound. He made a sound through his teeth that she felt in her own chest and kept going, because stopping would be worse. Henry looked away. Walt watched from his chair with the expression of a man at a hanging who had decided that looking away would be more disrespectful than looking. "Talk to me," Cole said, when she paused to blot the wound. She looked up at him. His eyes were focused. She could see him making them stay focused, a conscious act. "About what?" she said. "Anything." A pause. "Keeps me present." She understood what he meant. She nodded and went back to work. "I grew up in Providence," she said. "My father was a draftsman. He drew plans for buildings. I used to watch him work when I was very small. He had this flat table with a lamp on an arm, and he'd lean over it for hours with a pencil. Never smudged anything. I don't know how he managed it." She found the needle and thread. "I was never that careful with anything." Cole watched her thread the needle. His jaw tightened. "Boston," he said. "Calloway said you came from Boston." "That was later. I moved there for work when I was 22. She pressed a folded cloth against the exit wound and held it firm. "I was a bookkeeper. I was good at it." Why'd you leave? She kept her eyes on her work. The firm let me go. The owner's nephew needed the position, and family came first. A short pause. That was the official reason. What was the real one? She glanced up at him briefly. He was watching her with the gray-green eyes that had done inventory on her in the yard on her first day. And there was something different in them now. Not the inventory look, something more direct. Maybe it was the blood loss. Maybe it was that a man who's in pain stops having the energy for social calculation. I told the owner's wife that her husband was doctoring the accounts, Evelyn said. She'd asked me directly. I answered directly. That was apparently the wrong approach. A silence. You lost your job for telling the truth, Cole said. I lost my job for telling the truth to the wrong person at the wrong time, she corrected. She pressed harder on the wound, which is a different lesson. She sewed the exit wound closed with 11 stitches that were not neat but were functional, and she packed the entry wound with clean cloth and carbolic and bound the whole shoulder as tightly as she dared without restricting his breathing. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. Not proud of it, just grateful, the way you're grateful for weather that holds. By the time she finished, Cole's face had gone from gray to something closer to white, and he was leaning heavily on the table with his good arm. Henry had brought a blanket at some point without being asked, which she thought was decent instinct for a 19-year-old from Ohio. You need to lie down, she said. I need to know what happened to the herd. Walt. She said it without raising her voice. Walt stood up from his chair. 6 head gone off the north pasture. Rest are fine. Rustlers are gone. 2 men riding the perimeter. He looked at Cole. Everything that can be handled tonight is being handled. Cole looked at him. Then he looked at Evelyn. He seemed to be trying to formulate some further objection and finding that the materials weren't available. All right, he said. It took both Henry and Walt to get him to his room, and Evelyn followed to make sure they got him into the bed without doing anything inadvisable to the shoulder. The room was as spare as she'd expected. A bed, a chest, a chair with a coat thrown over it, a window facing east. Nothing personal anywhere, which fit with what Walt had told her on the back steps 6 weeks ago about a man who had shut something down. She stood in the doorway and watched Henry arrange the blanket with the awkward tenderness of someone trying to be useful. I'll check on him every half hour until the doctor arrives, she said. Henry, you'll come get me if anything changes before that. Yes, ma'am. He glanced at her with something she recognized after a moment as genuine gratitude. That was... Go outside and drink some water, she said. You look like you're going to fall over. He went. She went back to the kitchen and tended to Walt's arm, which was a laceration from barbed wire rather than a gunshot, and considerably more straightforward. Walt sat still for it and said nothing until she was almost done. You've done medical work before, he said. It was halfway between a question and an observation. No. She tied off the bandage. I read a lot. He was quiet for a moment. That was a difficult thing you just did. It needed doing. Not everyone would have done it. She sat back and looked at the medical tin, at the used cloths and the bottle of carbolic, and the needle she'd have to properly sterilize and put away. The kitchen smelled of blood and antiseptic, and underneath that, the bread dough she'd left covered on the far counter, still quietly rising without any regard for the circumstances. Go rest, she said to Walt. I'll call you if anything changes. After he left, she sat in the kitchen alone for the first time since before dawn. The light had come up while she'd been working. It was past 7 o'clock, she realized. The morning fully arrived. And the normal ranch day was going on around the crisis, the way days do. She could hear the horses, birds somewhere. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. They were steady, which still surprised her slightly. She had not known, going in, whether they would be. She got up and checked the bread dough. The doctor arrived before noon. His name was Albright, a compact, gray-haired man with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been roused from his own work on short notice and intended to make the most of the ride back. He examined Cole's shoulder for a long time without speaking, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and waited for his verdict with the specific anxiety of someone waiting to find out if their arithmetic was right. Through and through, Albright said finally. Clean enough. He looked at the stitching. Who did this? I did, Evelyn said. He turned to look at her, She couldn't tell from his expression whether this was impressive or alarming, and she suspected from the way he kept his face that he'd had a great deal of practice not showing either. "The packing's correct," he said. "The binding could be looser." He began adjusting it as he spoke. "He'll need to stay down for a week. Shoulder won't function properly for a month at minimum. Infection's the risk now. Watch for heat, swelling, fever. If any of those, send for me immediately." "Yes." He glanced at her again. The same assessing look, though different from Cole's, more clinical. "You have nursing experience?" "No." "You were a doctor's assistant of some kind?" "I was a bookkeeper." Albright looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to his bag. "Make sure he drinks. He's lost a significant quantity of blood and will want to sleep, which is fine, but fluids are essential." He snapped the bag shut. "Whoever you are, Miss Hart, Miss Hart, you very likely kept that man from bleeding out or developing a severe infection before I could arrive." He said it the way he probably said most things, flatly, as a statement of observable fact with no particular ornamentation. "The stitching is functional, if not elegant." "I'm aware," she said. "Good." He picked up his bag. $20 for the call. You can send it to the office in Garrett. He was back on his horse inside 5 minutes. Evelyn watched him go from the porch, and then she stood there a moment longer in the morning sun, and then she went back inside. Cole was a difficult patient. This surprised her less than it probably should have. He was a man who had arranged his life to require the minimum possible assistance from other people, and lying in bed while someone else ran his ranch was, for him, a particular variety of suffering that had nothing to do with the physical pain, which she suspected was considerable, and which he categorically refused to discuss. He did not complain. He was not dramatic about his situation. He simply lay there in the way of a man who was very bad at lying still and was being very disciplined about it, and he asked questions, constant questions. How many head were confirmed on the south pasture? Had anyone ridden the fence line on the north draw where the rustlers had come through? Was there enough grain in the store for another 2 weeks, or should they send to town? Where was Walt, and what was he doing? Evelyn answered the questions she could answer and relayed the others to Walt, and came back with answers. She brought broth, and made sure he drank it, and changed the dressing morning and evening with the carbolic, and watched for the signs Albright had listed. She did this alongside cooking 3 meals a day, and managing a kitchen, and learning, still, every single day, the 100 things she didn't know about how this ranch ran. On the second evening, she brought him supper, and he looked at the bowl and said, "Sit down." She paused. "I have things to finish in the... They'll keep 5 minutes." He said it without force, just as a statement. "Sit." She sat in the chair by the window. The light outside was long and golden, the mountains going purple at the edges. Cole was propped up against the headboard with the careful posture of a man managing pain, holding the bowl in his one functioning hand. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "Fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "Hurts," he said, with a slight shift in his expression that might have been acknowledgement. "It hurts. What do you want me to say about it?" "Nothing in particular. I just prefer accurate information to comfortable information." "I know." He ate a spoonful of the stew she'd brought. "Walt told me what you said when Dix went for Garrett and you were waiting for the doctor." "I said a lot of things." "He said you didn't panic." Cole looked at the bowl. "He said you moved through it like you'd done it before." "I hadn't done it before." "I know." A pause. "That's what he was trying to say." The room was quiet. Outside, the last of the day was burning off the mountains. "Why did you do it?" Cole said. It wasn't an accusation, just a direct question, the kind he seemed to prefer. "Because no one else was going to," she said. "That's not an answer." She thought about it. "You gave me work when you didn't have to," she said finally. "I don't forget things like that." He looked at her for a moment, that same direct look, taking inventory. And then he nodded, once, and went back to his stew. She sat with the fading light and the sound of the ranch settling into evening, and something in her chest that had been drawn tight since the morning she got off the train felt, for the first time, slightly less so. The weeks of Cole's recovery were strange ones, in the way that disrupted routines always produce strangeness. The ranch ran, because ranches run, There's an urgency in the land and the animals that doesn't pause for injury or incident, but it ran differently, with a gap at its center where the man who made the decisions usually stood. Walt stepped into that gap with the ease of long practice, and Evelyn began to understand that Walt had been doing this quietly for years, that he was the kind of man whose competence operated mostly underground, unannounced, going unrecognized precisely because it was so steady, it looked like the natural order of things. She found herself working alongside him in a different way during those weeks. Not just cook to ranch hand, but something more collaborative, because Cole from his bed was relying on both of them to translate between what needed doing in the yard and what he could authorize from a bedroom 20 feet away. She would bring Walt's questions to Cole and Cole's decisions back to Walt, and gradually, without quite meaning to, she began to understand the ranch in a way she hadn't before. Not just its hunger, not just the quantities of flour and salt pork and dried beans required to keep 8 men working, but its logic, the way the pastures rotated, the way the water rights on the North Creek intersected with the neighboring Alden property, the fence lines that needed maintenance before the first snow and the fence lines that could wait. She started keeping notes, just for her own reference initially. Then because Cole, when she came to relay Walt's questions, began asking her what she thought. "The Alden fence line," he said one morning, on the 5th day of his recovery. "Walt wants to know if we do the north section now, or wait for the Garrett post order to come in." "Now," Evelyn said. "The Garrett order is going to be delayed. I heard from Mrs. Calloway that the stage road between Garrett and Pueblo has been washed out since last week's rain, and the supply wagon isn't running. That could be another 10 days. The north section won't survive another 10 days if the weather turns." Cole was quiet for a moment. "What would you use instead of the Garrett posts?" "There's good timber on the South Ridge. Henry told me there's always been timber there, but nobody's gone for it because the Garrett posts were cheaper. If you have someone cut lumber over the next 2 days and start on the north section immediately, you could be done before the weather changes." He looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with a hypothesis being revised. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to most things," she said. It came out slightly more direct than she'd intended, but she didn't retract it. Cole almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything resembling a smile from him, and it was such a small thing, just a slight ease at the corners of his mouth, that she might have missed it. "Tell Walt to send 2 men to the South Ridge," he said. She turned to go. "Miss Hart," she paused. "You should be writing this down," he said. "What you know about the ranch, the supplies, the schedules, the things you've noticed." A pause. "I've been running this operation without anyone keeping proper records. It's a gap." She thought of the notes she'd been keeping in the small leather journal she'd brought from Boston, used first for grocery accounts and now filling up with other things entirely. "I've already started," she said. He looked at her. Then he nodded, and she went to find Walt, and something between them settled into a different arrangement than what it had been before, though she wouldn't have been able to say precisely what the new arrangement was or what to call it. It was Henry who first told her about Douglas Pratt. She was in the yard a week and a half into Cole's recovery, hanging laundry in the dry afternoon wind, when Henry came back from a supply run to town with a particular expression on his face, something caught between reluctance and the particular compulsive honesty of people who are bad at keeping things to themselves. "Something's being said in town," he told her, not quite meeting her eyes. "About Mr. Pratt." She kept hanging laundry. "What's being said? That things aren't that the ranch isn't going well. His ranch, I mean. People are saying he had some kind of arrangement with a buyer that fell through, and Miss Yates—" Henry stopped. Evelyn put a shirt on the line. "What about Miss Yates?" "She went back to her family in Denver," Henry said. "Left 3 weeks ago, from what I heard." She stood with the sheet in her hands for a moment and looked at the mountains. They were exactly as indifferent as they'd always been, which she found, on balance, helpful. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I just thought you'd want to know." "I do." She pinned the sheet and reached for the next piece. "Henry, does the bunkhouse stove still have that problem with the flue drawing wrong?" He looked thrown by the change of subject, which was what she'd intended. Yeah. Smokes when you first light it. I'll have a look at it this evening. It'll be worse when the cold comes." He went, uncertain, and she finished the laundry with her hands doing the work while some other part of her processed what she'd just heard and sorted it into the ledger of her life in this place. Douglas Pratt. The man who had stood on a train platform and handed her money the way you tip a porter and called her situation an inconvenience. The man because of whom she had walked away from a platform into a life she had not chosen and was now, she paused over this word but found no more accurate one, building. She felt almost nothing about it, which surprised her. No, that wasn't honest. She felt something, but it was small and it was old the way a scar is old, present, slightly sensitive if you pressed it, but not commanding. Not anymore. Cole was out of bed at the end of the second week, against Albright's instructions and over Evelyn's stated objections, which he listened to with his full attention and then disregarded. "You said stated objections," he said, pulling on his shirt one-handed with considerable difficulty. "That means you knew I wasn't going to listen." "It means I wanted it on record that I told you," she said. "Don't move the arm." "I'm not moving it." "You're about to." He stopped. The shirt was half-buttoned, the left side hanging loose where he couldn't work the buttons without rotating the shoulder. He stood there with a very particular expression, a man who had just encountered the specific humiliation of a task he couldn't perform, and said nothing. Evelyn stepped forward and buttoned the left side without commenting on it. Her hands worked the buttons quickly, impersonally. She stepped back. "Thank you," Cole said, in a voice that suggested the words had required some effort. "You should have stayed in bed another 3 days," she said. "I know. But you're up now, so move slowly and don't lift anything, and if you feel dizzy, sit down immediately and don't try to prove anything to anyone about how well you're recovering." He turned to look at her. "You sound like you've said that before." "I've been saying it to you in various forms for 12 days, she said. "You haven't been listening, but I've been saying it." The almost smile again. A little more present this time, a little less contained. "I've been listening," he said. "I just haven't been doing what you said." "That's not listening. That's hearing." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that had gotten more readable over the past 2 weeks. Or perhaps she'd just gotten better at reading them. "You have strong opinions about the difference," he said. "I have strong opinions about most things," she said. "You've probably noticed." "I've noticed," he said. And the way he said it was not the way she'd heard him say things before. Not the flat efficiency of a man who communicated in the minimum number of words required for the situation. There was something else in it, something she set to one side to look at later. She went back to the kitchen. The bread was ready to come out. Chess. The first time she went back to town in any real way, not a quick supply run but an actual afternoon, was 5 weeks after Cole was shot, on a Saturday when the ranch was quiet and Walt told her in his understated way that she could take the afternoon if she wanted it. She went on the horse she'd borrowed on her first day, which Mrs. Calloway had arranged for her to keep on loan indefinitely, and she rode the 7 miles into Harlan's Creek with her posture straight and her face arranged in the expression she'd been assembling on that same road since the beginning. The town was different with her in it now. Not dramatically different. She was not naive about how fast small places changed their minds about people, but measurably different in the quality of attention she received. Less of the particular sideways watching that had followed her those first days. A woman she didn't know nodded to her outside the mercantile. The depot agent asked, with what seemed like genuine interest, how things were at the Mercer Ranch. She ran her errands. She stopped at the Calloway house for coffee and sat with Mrs. Calloway in the kitchen, which was not the formal dining room, and felt like an acknowledgement of some standing she hadn't had before. "Cole's recovering well?" Mrs. Calloway asked. "He's difficult," Evelyn said. "But yes." Mrs. Calloway's expression suggested this was not surprising to her. She poured more coffee. "People are saying good things about what you did when he was shot." "I did what needed doing." "Most people don't when it comes to it." Mrs. Calloway set the pot down. "Douglas Pratt came into town last week. He's been talking to people, trying to renegotiate some cattle agreements." A careful pause. "He asked after you." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "I told him you were working at the Mercer Ranch and seemed to be doing well," Mrs. Calloway said. "He didn't say much to that." She thought about what Henry had told her. Claire Yates going back to Denver, the buyer arrangement that had collapsed. She thought about a man standing on a platform, turning his hat around by the brim. "Did he?" she said. "He looked," Mrs. Calloway said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had seen a great deal and drawn her own conclusions. like a man who had made a decision he was reconsidering. Evelyn finished her coffee. She looked at the window, at the main street of Harlan's Creek going about its ordinary Saturday business. People reconsider things, she said. That's their right. It is, Mrs. Calloway agreed. She did not say anything further, which was one of the things Evelyn had come to value most about her. On the ride back to the ranch, the light was long and amber over the mountains, and the horse moved steadily through it, and Evelyn sat with the motion of it and thought about reconsidering and about the things that can and cannot be reclaimed once they've been let go. By the time the ranch buildings came into view, she had decided she didn't want to think about Douglas Pratt anymore, and she found, almost to her own surprise, that the decision held. Cole was on the porch when she rode in, sitting in one of the chairs with his arm in the sling she'd made him wear and a ledger open on his knee. He looked up when she came through the gate. She tied the horse and came up the porch steps, and he watched her in that way he had, not intrusive, just present. And she thought about what it meant that coming back here felt already more like arriving somewhere than leaving somewhere behind. "Town all right?" he said. "Town was fine," she said. She paused at the door. "You left the ledger out in the direct sun. The pages will warp." He looked down at the ledger. Then he shifted his chair into the shade of the porch roof without comment. She went inside and the screen door swung shut behind her, and the evening started the way evenings did here. All at once. Everything going golden and then going purple and then going dark. And she stood in the kitchen and started supper and felt, for the first time in a very long while, like she knew where she was. Autumn came to the Mercer Ranch the way it came to most things in that part of Colorado, without asking permission and with considerable force. The first cold front arrived in early October, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees overnight and leaving a skim of ice on the water troughs that the horses broke through with their muzzles in the gray pre-dawn hours. Evelyn woke to the changed quality of the silence, colder, drier, somehow more serious, and lay still for a moment before getting up to build the kitchen fire higher than usual. By the time the first cowboys came in for breakfast, the kitchen was warm and the coffee was made, and she had figured out, through trial and a moderate amount of error, how to time the biscuits so they came out of the oven as the men sat down rather than 20 minutes before or after. She had been at the Mercer Ranch for 4 months. She was not the same woman who had climbed off a borrowed horse in this yard and looked at a grease-filmed stove and thought about walls moving in from all directions. She was still herself, still square-jawed and plain-spoken, and possessed of opinions she sometimes had to consciously moderate. But she was herself in a different shape now, like a piece of wood that's been worked. Something had been revealed through the working. Cole's shoulder had healed enough by October that the sling was gone and the arm was functional, though he favored it in cold weather, which she noticed without commenting on because she had learned which things were worth commenting on and which things were not. He moved through the ranch with the same focused efficiency as before, but something had shifted between them during the weeks of his recovery, something in the calibration of how they occupied the same spaces. There was less formal distance. There was, she thought, more of whatever the opposite of formal distance was. She hadn't settled on a word for it yet. They ate supper together most evenings now, not by arrangement, but by the natural gravity of two people who were up earlier and to bed later than everyone else, and who found, apparently, that the company was not unwelcome. Cole was not a conversationalist in the social sense. He did not talk for the pleasure of talking, and long silences between them were common. But he talked when he had something to say, and she had learned that what he said was almost always worth listening to. "You've been keeping records on the North Creek water flow," he said one evening, about 2 weeks into the cold weather. It was not a question. "Since September," she said. "I noticed the level was lower than it should be for the time of year. I've been noting it every 3 days." He looked at the notebook she'd set on the table, the same leather journal she'd brought from Boston, now more than half filled with things that had nothing to do with grocery accounts. "Can I see it?" She pushed it across. He read through the pages slowly, with the same attention he gave to everything, and she ate her supper and waited. "The Alden property runs a diversion ditch off the North Creek," he said finally. "I know. If they've extended it, the flow numbers suggest they have, or someone else upstream has. The decrease is consistent, and it started in late August." She paused. "I don't know enough about water law here to know what your options are." Cole set the notebook down. He looked at the table for a moment with the expression he got when he was working through something. not thinking loudly, just present with the problem. "There's a man in Garrett," he said. "Hendricks. He handles land disputes, water rights. I've used him once before." He looked up at her. "This is good work." She accepted this the way she accepted most things from him, without deflecting it and without making too much of it. "I can ride to Garrett with the records if you want to send them." "I'll go myself when the shoulders—" "Your shoulder is fine for a 7-mile ride," she said. "What you mean is you'll go when you've decided you're ready." He looked at her. Then he almost smiled and she looked down at her plate. The notebook became, over the following weeks, a kind of shared document, something she maintained and he reviewed, and something between them passed back and forth through its pages without either of them naming what that was. D. Henry left in the middle of October. It was not unexpected. He'd been talking about going home to Ohio for his mother's birthday, going back briefly before winter set in. But when the morning came that he packed his things into his saddlebag and stood in the kitchen doorway looking like a large, uncertain puppy, Evelyn found she'd underestimated how much she would miss him. "I'll be back in the spring," he said. "Maybe before. If there's still work here." "There's always work here," Evelyn said. She handed him a wrapped bundle she'd put together the evening before. Biscuits and salt pork and dried apple slices for the road. "Tell your mother happy birthday from someone who never met her." He took the bundle and held it, and then, with the impulsive sincerity of a 19-year-old from Ohio who had decided she was essentially family, he said, "You're the best cook we've ever had, and I don't just mean the food." She thought about this for a moment. "Go catch your horse," she said, "before I make it awkward." He grinned and went. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out and felt the particular soft ache of affection for a person you hadn't expected to care about, and then somehow had. A new man came on in Henry's place, a cowboy named Rourke, hired from a ranch down in the valley that had downsized for the winter. He was 30-something and dark-complexioned and capable with horses in a way that impressed even Walt, who was not easily impressed. He did not talk much, which she respected. He ate everything put in front of him, which she also respected. He had a scar along his jaw that she didn't ask about, and he didn't ask about the situation she'd arrived in, and they understood each other on that basis. The ranch had a different quality in the winter, smaller, somehow, as though the cold had drawn the perimeter in. The days were shorter and the work shifted, less open-range work, more maintenance, the ongoing effort of keeping animals alive and buildings functional in temperatures that had genuine intentions. She learned to read the weather off the mountains the way Walt did, by the quality of the clouds over the western peaks in late afternoon. She learned that the barn had a warm spot near the far stall where the horses generated heat and where you could stand for 5 minutes and restore some feeling to your hands. She learned that Cole Mercer was a better cook than he'd ever let on, and that he occasionally came into the kitchen after she'd gone to bed and made himself something from whatever was left, and she began intentionally leaving materials for this purpose without mentioning it. He never mentioned it either, but one morning he told her without preamble that the sourdough starter needed more rye flour, and she understood from this that he had been tending to it in the evenings, and they did not discuss it further. It was Walt who first brought Douglas Pratt's name back into her awareness in a way she couldn't easily set aside. She was degreasing the stove, a monthly operation she had elevated to something approaching a ritual, when Walt came through the kitchen with his coat on, and a look on his face she recognized as the precursor to something he'd been turning over for a while. "Town talk," he said, by way of preface, and she knew then it was something he'd decided she should hear rather than something he particularly wanted to say. "All right," she said without stopping her work. "Pratt's been talking to some of the bigger landholders about a water agreement, trying to put together a consortium, sort of arrangement where several ranches pool rights on the creek system." A pause. "People are saying he needs the capital from the arrangement to cover debts. His operation it's struggling." "I heard that in the summer," Evelyn said. "It's worse now." Walt sat down at the table without being invited, which meant he had more to say. "He's been asking about this ranch specifically, whether there'd be interest in Cole joining the consortium." She stopped working. "Is there interest?" "Cole hasn't said. I don't think he knows Pratt's involved yet." Walt looked at the table. "I thought you should know before he heard it elsewhere." "Why me?" Walt looked up at her with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that she'd come to trust more than almost anything else in this place. Because you've got a stake in how this information lands, he said. And because Cole... He stopped, chose different words. Because whatever Cole decides about this, it'll be better if the conversation happens in the right order. She thought about this for a moment. You mean he should hear about Pratt's involvement from me before he hears it as town gossip? Yes. She went back to the stove. She worked the cloth over the left burner in slow circles, the same motion she'd been doing since her first week here, and she thought about order and right order and the way information could be handed to a person like a loaded firearm. The intent mattered, but so did the grip. I'll tell him tonight, she said. She did. After supper, with the kitchen cleared and the fire banked down and the cold pressing at the windows, she set Walt's information in front of Cole the way she'd set the water flow notebook, plainly, completely, without editorializing. Cole sat with it. Pratt, he said finally, not with particular emotion, just locating the name. Yes. He's in financial trouble. That's what Walt heard. I don't know the specifics. Cole turned his coffee cup around once. And he's trying to assemble a water consortium. Yes. On a creek system that I have existing rights on. He looked at her. If he needs the consortium to cover debts, he needs every rancher in the system to participate. If I don't participate, the consortium doesn't work. That's what I understood, she said. The fire made sounds. The wind outside moved against the eaves. He rejected you on a train platform in front of half the town, Cole said. He said it without particular inflection, just as a fact he was accounting for. He did. And now he needs something from this ranch. It appears so. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Evelyn sat with the quiet and did not rush it, because she had learned the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that was doing its own work. I need to think about the water rights question on its own merits, Cole said finally. Whatever Pratt's situation is, the North Creek issue is real, and joining a managed consortium might or might not be the right response to it. He looked at her. Those are separate things. Yes, she agreed. They are. I want to know what you think. This was not the first time he'd asked her that, but it still landed with a particular weight. I think you're right that they're separate, she said carefully. The water question needs answering on its practical terms, and I think... She paused. I think if you decide a consortium is the right answer to the water question, it should be because of the water, not because of any feeling either of us has about the man proposing it. Cole looked at her for a moment. Either of us, he said. I have feelings about Douglas Pratt, she said. I'd be dishonest if I claimed I didn't. I just don't think those feelings should influence a business decision about water rights. Something shifted in Cole's face, not a smile, something quieter and more considered than a smile. That's a very precise answer. I'm a precise person. I know. He looked back at the fire. I'll write to Hendricks and Garrett, get a proper read on the water rights situation before anything else. She nodded. Evelyn! It was the first time he'd used her given name. She heard it with a slight adjustment, the way you adjust to a key change in something you've been listening to. Yes, she said. I'm sorry that happened to you, he said. On the platform, that first day. He said it the way he said most things, directly, with no ornamentation, but it cost something. She could hear that it cost something, and she received it accordingly. I know, she said. Thank you. And that was all. But it was enough. Douglas Pratt came to the ranch on a Thursday in late November. He arrived around mid-morning, which Evelyn thought was deliberate. A social call hour, not a working hour, calculated to suggest casualness. She was in the kitchen when she heard horses in the yard and looked through the window and saw him dismounting at the gate, and she stood very still for a moment and did the thing she'd learned to do, taking stock, taking inventory of what she felt and what she intended to do with what she felt. What she felt was less than she'd expected. A tightening, yes, a particular kind of alertness, but not the old shame, not the contracted helplessness of the platform. That was gone, or far enough below the surface that it wasn't in charge. She dried her hands and went to the front door. Cole was already on the porch. He'd seen the rider from the yard and had come around from the side of the barn, and he stood at the top of the porch steps in his coat, with his hat in his hand and his expression set to whatever it defaulted to when he was thinking. Pratt had aged. It was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it with the clinical detachment of someone who has recently learned to take inventory. He was still tall, still broad-shouldered, still had the mustache she'd privately found excessive, but something had gone out of him. He had the look of a man whose confidence has been worn down to its structural elements and is operating on those alone. He stopped when he saw Evelyn in the doorway. Something crossed his face, complicated, fast, not quite readable. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Pratt," she said. A beat. Cole stood between them, literally and in every other sense, and did not speak. Pratt cleared his throat. "Mercer, I appreciate you seeing me. I know it's an uninvited call." "I don't get many invited calls," Cole said. "Come up." They went into the front room, which was the room Cole used for ranch business. A table, 3 chairs, a shelf with ledgers, and a rolled territorial map pinned to the wall. Evelyn brought coffee because it was what you did, and because she had decided she would not absent herself from this. Cole had not asked her to stay, but he had not asked her to leave either, and she had learned enough about this man to know that silence on the subject was not omission. She sat down at the end of the table with her hands around her cup and her face arranged for listening. Pratt looked at her once, briefly, and then looked at Cole and began talking. The situation was more complicated than Walt's summary had suggested. Pratt had purchased his ranch 3 years earlier on the assumption of water access from the North Creek system that turned out to be less secure than the deed implied. He had spent 2 years and considerable money trying to formalize the rights through the Territorial Land Office and had gotten what he described as runaround. Filings delayed, paperwork mislaid, the sense that someone with better standing was using the system to block his access. The consortium would formalize shared rights for all the ranches on the creek system, he said. Managed allocation through the summer dry months, guaranteed minimums through winter. I've got 3 ranchers committed already. I need 2 more to make it viable. He looked at Cole. You have one of the best positions on the North Fork. Your participation would anchor the whole arrangement. Cole said nothing. He was looking at the territorial map on the wall. You'd benefit from it too, Pratt said. The informal arrangement you have now is vulnerable. If someone with money wanted to challenge your access, I'm aware of my vulnerabilities, Cole said, without particular heat. Pratt stopped. Evelyn watched them both. She watched Pratt's hands around his cup. He was doing the same thing with the cup that he'd done with his hat on the train platform, turning it. And she watched Cole's absolute stillness and thought about the difference between a man who performed certainty and a man who had it. I want to see the consortium documents, Cole said, the proposed allocation schedule, the legal structure, the names of the other participants. I'll have my lawyer and Garrett review them. Yes, of course. I can have them to you within the week. Cole nodded, once. That appeared to be the end of the business portion of the meeting, but Pratt didn't stand up. He was looking at his cup. Miss Hart, he said, without raising his eyes. I owe you an apology. The room went very quiet. The fire made a sound. Evelyn looked at him steadily. She waited. What I did on that platform was, I handled it poorly, he said. You came a long distance on the basis of an agreement I broke. I should have written. I should have given you the opportunity to make different arrangements before you arrived. The way I did it, he stopped. It wasn't right. She held the silence for a moment after he finished, long enough that she could say what she meant and not what she was feeling, because she had learned the difference. I appreciate that, she said, genuinely. Pratt looked up. It's not something I'm carrying anymore, she said. I want you to know that, not for your sake. For your sake, it doesn't matter what I'm carrying, but because it's true, and I'd rather you have an accurate picture. She set her cup down. I think you handled it badly. I think you knew it at the time. But what you did landed me here, and I have made something here that I wouldn't trade. She paused. So the accounting doesn't quite work out the way either of us would have expected. Pratt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole, and whatever he read in Cole's face made him look back down at his cup. I'm glad, he said, that things worked out. He didn't linger after that. Cole walked him to the porch, and they exchanged a few words about the document delivery, and then Pratt mounted and rode back toward town, and the sound of the horse faded into the ordinary winter quiet of the ranch. Cole came back inside and stood in the doorway of the front room. Evelyn was still sitting at the table. You handled that well, he said. I said what I meant. That's what I meant by well. He came in and sat back down in his chair, picked up his coffee. You meant what you said? About not carrying it anymore? She thought about this honestly. Mostly, she said, there's a part of a thing like that you always carry a little. But it doesn't, she searched for the right word, it doesn't steer anymore. He nodded, looking at the map on the wall. He's in worse shape than he presented, he said. The water rights issue is real, but there's something else. The way he was describing the land office delays, there's a pattern there that sounds like someone applied pressure, not just bureaucratic slow walking. She felt her attention sharpen. Someone blocked his filings deliberately. That would be my read. Cole looked at her. I want to look at this more carefully before I decide about the consortium. If someone is manipulating water rights in this territory, that concerns every rancher on the creek system, including me. He paused. Including Pratt. She thought about the North Creek numbers in her notebook, the steady decrease since August, the timeline. Cole, she said. The drop in our creek flow started in August. Pratt said his land office filings started getting delayed about 8 months ago. She leaned forward slightly. That's not a coincidence. He looked at her. Someone is trying to control the water on this creek system, she said, and they're doing it by blocking the formal process while simultaneously restricting supply. If Pratt can't formalize his rights and the consortium fails, and if your access is more vulnerable than it looks, she stopped herself. Who else is on the North Fork? Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and crossed to the map on the wall. The Alden property runs the North Draw, he said, pointing. Then there's a smaller spread. The Harmon place, only been there 2 years, Eastern money, mostly absentee. And above that, he stopped. What? She said. Above that is a land parcel that changed hands about 14 months ago. I don't know who owns it now. The original owner was a man named Carver who went back east. He looked at the map. I should know who owns that land. Yes, she said. You should. He turned around, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not alarm, but the look of a man who has just seen the shape of a problem he thought was one thing and understood was another. I'm going to Garrett, he said, tomorrow, and I'm not just going to see Hendricks about the consortium documents. She stood up. I'll make you food for the road. I'll be back the same day. It's a 20-mile round trip in November, she said. You'll want food for the road. He looked at her. He almost smiled. All right, he said. Cole was gone most of the next day, and Evelyn ran the ranch in the way she'd been running it during his recovery. Not in his place, but alongside its normal workings, managing the kitchen and answering the questions that were answerable, and noting down the ones that weren't. Rourke and Walt handled the yard work without needing direction, which she appreciated. She spent part of the afternoon looking through the records she'd been keeping since September, cross-referencing the water flow numbers against the dates in Cole's land documents, which he had left on the table in the front room without comment. She was good at patterns. She had always been good at patterns. It was what had made her a good bookkeeper, the ability to look at a column of numbers and feel when something was wrong before she could articulate exactly why. Something was wrong with the numbers on this creek system. By the time Cole came back in the early evening, blue-chilled from the ride, and with the particular tightness around his eyes that meant he had news he was still processing, she had 3 pages of notes and a list of questions. He came into the kitchen and stood near the stove for warmth, and she poured him coffee without asking and waited. The parcel above Carver's old place, he said. It was purchased 14 months ago by a land company called Consolidated Western Holdings. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Hendricks knows the name. He's seen it in 2 other counties. It's a holding company, moves fast, buys water-adjacent land, and then maneuvers to control the water rights above the existing holders. He paused. There's a man behind it. Hendricks thinks it's a speculator named Garrett Wade, not from around here. He works through intermediaries. So he's been acquiring land upstream, Evelyn said. And blocking the formal rights filings of everyone downstream, Cole said. If Pratt can't formalize, and if I can't prove my existing access, and if the other ranchers give up and sell, he stopped. He ends up controlling the water supply for the whole North Fork Valley, she said. Yes. She looked at her notes. And then he can name his price for water access to every ranch that depends on the creek. Or he can sell the whole water position to a major cattle operation that wants to monopolize the valley. Cole sat down heavily. Hendricks has seen it done before, twice. Both times it took 2 or 3 years, and by the time the ranchers understood what was happening, it was too late. She was quiet for a moment. How far along is he here? Far enough. Cole looked at her. The consortium Pratt's proposing, if it got formal legal standing, properly structured, it would actually block Wade's strategy. Formalized shared rights among 5 ranches is harder to undermine than individual informal access. He turned the cup around, which is probably why the filings keep getting delayed. Someone in the land office is working with Wade, Evelyn said. That's what Hendricks thinks. He can't prove it. She sat with this for a moment. The fire, the sound of the wind, the particular weight of a problem that was larger than it had first appeared. You're going to join the consortium, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I think I have to. Cole looked at the table. And I think Pratt needs to know what he's actually up against. He paused. He's not going to like it. No, she agreed. But he needs accurate information more than he needs comfortable information. Cole looked at her when she said that, the slightly sharp look, like a hypothesis being revised, and she realized she'd used his own logic back at him without meaning to. I said that to you once, he said. You did, she said. You were right. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she was aware of the particular quality of the silence between them, warm, without pressure, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the wind moved against the eaves, and the cold pressed at the glass, and the ranch sat in its winter dark with its fences and its ledgers and its horses and its accumulated months of shared work. Evelyn, Cole said. She looked at him. I'm glad you stayed, he said. Plain as everything else, he said, direct as everything else, he said, with nothing extra added and nothing taken away. She held the words for a moment before answering. So am I, she said, and the fire burned down, and they sat together in the kitchen as they had sat many evenings, and outside the first real snow of winter was beginning to fall across the Mercer Ranch, soft, indiscriminate, covering everything equally, and neither of them moved to end the evening, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The snow that had begun falling on the last evening of Part 3 did not stop for 2 days. It came down in the steady, purposeful way of a Colorado winter that had decided it was done being polite about things. Not dramatic, not furious, just committed, piling itself against the fence lines and the barn doors and the kitchen window ledge with the patient indifference of a force that did not care what it inconvenienced. By the second morning, the ranch was a different place entirely. The familiar geography of yard and pasture gone soft and white and unmarked, and Evelyn stood in the kitchen window in the early dark with her coffee and looked at it and thought that there was something almost honest about snow, the way it covered everything equally, the way it did not distinguish. The work did not stop because of it. That was one of the things she had learned about this life, that the animals did not stop needing water and feed because the conditions were difficult, and so the people who kept the animals did not stop either. Cole was out before first light both mornings, and Walt and Rourke behind him, and she kept the kitchen going in the way a fire is kept going, constantly attended, never allowed to go entirely cold. On the third morning, the snow stopped and the sky came out sharp and blue, and the world was briefly, unreasonably beautiful. Cole came in for breakfast with ice in his mustache and a look on his face she had come to associate with a decision that had been running in the background and had just come fully forward. I'm going to Pratt's ranch today, he said. She set a plate in front of him. Road will be passable by mid-morning. I know. He looked at his coffee. He needs to know what Wade is doing before he makes any more moves with the consortium that could tip Wade off that someone's looking at the structure. You think Wade has eyes in town? I think a man who is carefully manipulating land filings through a corrupt office has arrangements in more than one place. He picked up his fork. I also think Pratt is running out of time faster than he knows. She sat down across from him. Walt and Rourke were still in the barn. It was just the two of them in the warm kitchen with the white world outside, and the decision sitting on the table between them. Take the records I've been keeping, she said. The water flow data. It's documentation that the diversion has been happening. If he needs to make a legal argument, That's evidence. Cole looked up at her. I was going to ask if I could. You don't have to ask. He held her gaze for a moment. Those records are your work. They're records about your ranch, she said, and now apparently about a scheme that affects half the ranches in this valley. They should be used. She stood up and went to get the notebook from the front room. When she came back and set it on the table beside his plate, he put his hand briefly over hers before taking it. It lasted about 2 seconds. His hand was cold from the barn and rough from the winter work and entirely serious. And then it was gone. And he turned his attention to the notebook, and she sat back down and picked up her coffee and looked at the window. Neither of them said anything about it. But the 2 seconds sat in the room with them like a third presence, warm and quiet, and not going anywhere. Pante. Cole was gone most of the day. Evelyn spent it in the ordinary work of the ranch, cooking, the stove maintenance, an inventory of the dry stores that told her they would need a significant supply run before February. She repaired a tear in the kitchen curtain that had been bothering her for 2 months. She checked on the water trough in the south yard that had been freezing overnight and found Rourke already there, breaking the ice with a long-handled bar, and they worked beside each other for a few minutes in the comfortable silence of people who had no particular need to fill the air. Man works a lot of days in a row here, Rourke said after a while. He wasn't complaining, just observing. He does, Evelyn said. Good outfit, though. Rourke looked at the barn, at the neat fence lines, at the quality of the equipment. Can tell a lot about a man from how his place runs. What does this place tell you? Rourke considered. That he doesn't cut corners, and that he doesn't ask anything of the crew he won't do himself. A pause. Some men own ranches. Some men run them. That one? He tilted his head toward where Cole had ridden out that morning. He's not separate from it. Evelyn thought about a man who came in from the barn before dawn with ice on his face and ate his breakfast standing up because sitting down would cost him 5 minutes he'd rather spend with the horses. She thought about ledgers carefully maintained, fence lines held, a crew paid on time and treated squarely. No, she said, he's not separate from it. She went back inside with this thought, and the cold in her hands, and the particular quality of satisfaction that comes from a thing being accurately named. Cole came back in the late afternoon with Pratt. This was not what she'd expected. She heard 2 sets of hooves in the yard and looked out the window and saw them both dismounting, Cole saying something with his hand on his horse's neck, and Pratt nodding with the focused expression of a man receiving information he is trying to hold all at once. She put water on. They came in through the back, which was the way Cole always came in, and Pratt followed without being told, which told her something about the state of the afternoon. Coffee, Cole said to her, not as a request or a command, but as a simple communication, the way you tell someone the weather. Already on, she said. Pratt sat down at the kitchen table, not the front room table, the kitchen table, which she had not seen him sit at before, and which felt like a different kind of conversation than the one he'd initiated the last time he was here. He looked tired. He looked, she thought, like a man who had just spent several hours having a very large picture explained to him and was not entirely happy with what he could now see. Consolidated Western Holdings, he said, to the table. Yes, Cole said. He sat down across from him. Evelyn set cups in front of them both and moved to the counter, near enough to be present, far enough not to intrude. They bought the Carver parcel, Pratt said, above my north boundary, 14 months ago. And they've been blocking my filings at the land office for... He stopped. My filings started getting delayed about 8 months in. I thought it was incompetence, or the general difficulty of doing anything through that office. He rubbed the side of his face. It wasn't incompetence. No, Cole agreed. Someone in that office is working with them. Hendricks thinks so. He can't prove it yet. Pratt was quiet for a moment. When he looked up, there was something raw in his face. Not quite shame, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had been operating with incomplete information and whose decisions looked different in the rearrangement. I bought that ranch to start over, he said. He was not talking to Cole specifically. He seemed to be talking at the middle distance, working something out. After my first operation failed in Kansas, I thought I'd found a solid piece of ground. A pause. Clara leaving, that was partly... He stopped again. She wanted security. I told her I had it. I didn't have it, and I knew I didn't have it, and I told her I did. He picked up his cup. That was on me. The kitchen was quiet. Cole looked at the table. Evelyn looked at Pratt and thought about a man on a train platform turning his hat around by the brim. And she thought about the difference between a person who is cruel and a person who is afraid and does cruel things. And she thought that the difference mattered even if it didn't change the outcome. The consortium is still the right answer, Cole said, pulling the conversation back to useful ground. Formalized shared rights with legal standing will neutralize what Wade is trying to do, but it needs to be structured correctly, and it needs to be filed in the right office, not the local land office. Hendricks said the same, file directly with the territorial office in Denver. Pratt looked at Cole. That's more expensive. I know. I don't have... Pratt stopped. This cost him. She could see it cost him. I don't have the resources right now to carry my share of the legal costs. A silence. I'm aware, Cole said. We can work out a structure for the costs. Pratt looked at him with an expression that Evelyn recognized. It was the expression of a person who has been expecting a particular kind of response and received a different one and doesn't quite know what to do with the difference. Why? Pratt said. You don't owe me anything. He glanced at Evelyn briefly. I treated a person in your household badly. You'd be within your rights to let me sort my own troubles. Cole looked at him steadily. I'm not doing it for you, he said. I'm doing it because your water rights and my water rights are connected by the same creek, and if Wade wins this, he wins it over every ranch in the valley. Your bad luck is my bad luck, whether I like it or not. A pause. But I'm also not going to let a man lose his operation to a speculator when I have information that could stop it. That's not... I wouldn't be able to sit with that. Pratt was quiet for a long time. All right, he said finally. All right. Cole nodded. He turned to look at Evelyn. Can you make copies of those water records tonight? I want Pratt to take a set, and I want to send a set to Hendricks. Yes, she said. She had already started calculating what it would take. Pratt did not stay long after that. There was a follow-up meeting being arranged with Hendricks and the other consortium ranchers for the following week, and Cole walked him to his horse, and they talked in the yard for a few minutes in the last light